Hey everyone, Jonathan Bailor back, and today's show is I'm a little without words, obviously, because that phrase didn't make any sense. This show is going to be one for the ages because we have a man who demonstrates. This is a perfect example of the problem with the current model of fat loss and health that we've been given, which is. And what motivates me, when you look at the actual research, like when you talk to people like our guests today who spend their life researching metabolic function and endocrinology and neurobiology, like researchers, people who wear lab coats for a living, not spandex, and that's not what we're told. The science it's not even controversial, which is crazy, but the mainstream media makes it out to be, and that gets me fired up. I think it'll get you fired up too. Certainly gets our guest fired up, and that's why he wrote the wonderful book, The Fat Switch. He is the Thomas Burrell Professor and Chief of the Division of Renal Disease and Hypertension over at the University of Colorado. Dr. Richard J. Johnson, welcome to the show, brother.
Thank you very much. That's a very nice introduction.
Dr. Johnson, I have to tip my hat to you because you and so many other researchers out there, you dedicate your life to establishing science, like hard proven science. And you've done that, but it continues to be ignored by the mainstream. And we continue to hear the same theories about eating and exercise that we were told 40, 50 years ago, where in every other field of medicine, biology, technology, we stay up to speed. What's going on?
Well, there's been this classic thinking that the reason people gain weight is because it's our culture driving us, and that we are just eating too much because people are just giving us larger plates of food, and we're having bigger servings, and there's smorgasbords, and go back for seconds, and it's our culture that's giving us larger and larger plates, and we're exercising less because we got internet and TV and all the, escalators and cars and cell phones. And so the classic thinking has been, and it goes back to the 1920s, has been that we're suffering from overnutrition, and the reason is largely because our culture has moved forward, and it's the success of our culture that we don't have to work so hard and we don't have to walk so far. And so this got into the system probably about 1925, 1930. And so, everybody thinks that this is the cause, but actually science shows that is not the mechanism driving obesity. And I suspect that's the topic of your book, and it's also a big topic in my book. And the big breakthrough was when we discovered that satiety, or your appetite, basically, is governed by hormones. And it's governed by a hormone called leptin. And when you eat, normally an animal, if it eats, it will get, when it gets full, that sensation of fullness is actually driven by hormones. And then you quit eating. But in people who are getting fat, that hormone system's screwed up, and they become resistant to that hormone, which is called leptin. And so what happens is people keep eating more and more because they don't know that they haven't turned off their hunger response. And so the reason the culture has responded to us by giving us bigger plates of food and by giving us more foods. And we go back for seconds, not because it's there, but because we can't control our appetite. Now, the other side is that we are, studies have shown that people who are fat have trouble burning fat. They have a defect in their liver and other tissues in burning fat. And so they don't produce as much energy. And so when you don't produce enough energy, you actually get a little bit tired. And you want to sit in the sofa and watch TV. They did a study. You probably know about this study that was published in JAMA, where they took children who were watching 28 hours of TV and internet a week. And they said, aha, we can make these kids lose weight by just taking away their TV. So they did a controlled trial, and they took half of the children and they reduced their time watching TV by 50%. They put little monitors on the TV so they could really calculate how much time was being spent watching. And the theory was that if you reduced watching TV by 50%, that you'd exercise more. Makes sense, right? Guess what the result was? They exercised less. The ones that reduced their TV actually they exercised less. So it was a little bit of a mystery to the authors, but it's not really that surprising. And so one of the key things is normally animals regulate their weight. And, in my book, I talk about this. Animals will normally keep their weight very, very carefully regulated. And in fact, they not only regulate their weight, but many of them will regulate their weight for a particular season. So, the classic is the hibernating animal. He'll stay nice and lean during the spring and early summer, and then late summer he'll start eating more than he normally needs and starts to put on fat. And it's actually driven by hormones and all these different things. And then they get really, really fat. They get insulin resistant. They get like us. And then they hibernate and burn off the fat. So we're preparing for hibernation, I think. But those of us who are getting fat tend not to hibernate. And so we just are preparing for hibernation. We keep storing, and we store more fat. We get more insulin resistant. So finally things break through and become diabetic. But these other animals, they know that they're going to hibernate, and it's all regulated, and then they hibernate, they burn off the fat, and then the next year they repeat.
Dr. Johnson, we just got to get those bears on some treadmills, because clearly they're not trying hard enough to avoid that hibernation weight. They just need to eat less and exercise more. They just need to try harder.
Well, I tell you what, I'm actually doing some studies in bears right now in northern Sweden, where we're studying them when they're hibernating and when they're, and then during the summer when they're not. It's kind of, I'm working with a group of scientists in northern Sweden. It's kind of fun. It's all done very safely. There's no danger to the animals. They are darted with a little anesthetics that makes them fall asleep, and then we collect a blood sample, and then when they wake up, we make sure everything's okay. But it is true. We put a little GPS under their skin so we can track them when they hibernate. And I've got a nice picture I show of one of our guys who, when they go into the den to collect the sample, we put a little rope around their foot so that if the bear wakes up too fast, we can pull the guy out really quickly. It's pretty funny. But anyway, we can learn a lot. You can learn a lot from animals. And, even insects, they store fat when they go into the pupa, the cocoon, and then they burn it off. And so we've been trying to figure out what turns on and off the fat switch. And that was the title of my book, where we looked at this and then tried to link it over to what's going on in humans.
Dr. Johnson, what is so transformative about this research? It seems like you touched on the study about the children who watch television. Another study, which I'm sure you're familiar with, in 2012 with I'm going to mispronounce their name, but there was the Hazara tribe. And what the study showed, to no one's surprise, was that the Hazara foragers did burn more calories through exercise. But the shocking thing was that there was no statistically significant difference in total calories burned between the Hazara foragers and Westerners of similar ages. And they found that was because using doubly labeled water and blah, 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 that when the Hazara foragers weren't, quote unquote, exercising, they just burned less than they would have had they not exercised to maintain that critical state you described, which is that state of balance and that state of homeostasis. So if the body is this brilliant and works this hard to automatically regulate us, our listeners know the answer, but I just want to hear you say it. Why are we told to spend so much time trying to forcibly override our body's brilliance rather than working with it?
Okay, well, actually, I'm going to put a little twist in that. I'm not sure. I think you probably know this, but so it turns out that if you make a defect, if you block the ability of the animal to make energy, okay, like by blocking the ability to burn fat, what happens is that actually signals the animal to eat more itself. And what it does is it then eats more to try to equate so that in the end it burns the same number of calories as it wants to, but at the expense of having to eat more and shifting more of the energy into fat. Let me try to explain this. So the way that we regulate our weight is done by specific little organelles in each cell. We have these little things called mitochondria. And the mitochondria are the little regulators of our energy. And normally the food comes in and the mitochondria turns it into energy that we use to burn things. But what we discovered is that when an animal wants to change its weight, to gain weight, it has to trigger a change in that mitochondria where the mitochondria become less efficient. And so they produce less energy for the amount of fuel coming in. And so that extra fuel is turned into fat. It's actually highly regulated. Animals use it to gain fat. So, normally it's hard to make an animal gain fat. But if you trigger this change in the mitochondria, then they will put more of the energy into fat than into the energy you use to burn things like ATP. And then when you produce less ATP, then the body, in many cases, will try to eat more so that the complete output of energy becomes equal, but at the expense of accumulating fat. So interestingly, when we studied this, we found that certain specific foods could do this. And in particular, one food dramatically does this. And it's like the food for gaining fat. And it's fructose, which is the sugar that's present in table sugar and high fructose corn syrup. And so this little sugar is distinct from all other sugars in its ability to trigger those mitochondria to preferentially store fat. And so when we take animals, if we feed one set of animals fructose and we feed another set of animals glucose or some other nutrient, the fructose-fed animals will always accumulate more fat in their liver, and they will become more insulin resistant than the other group. There won't be a difference in weight if you control the diet so that both groups are eating exactly the same number of calories. Because what drives weight gain is you actually, to some extent, have to eat more energy than you expend. And so if you control animals so that they're eating exactly the same amount of calories, it's hard to show differences in weight in a short-term study. You can over time because of changes in metabolism, but it takes a year to really show a big difference in weight if animals are eating exactly the same number of calories. But the difference is that when they eat fructose, they will put more of the calories into fat. So you'll see fat in the liver, you'll see the development of insulin resistance and all those things that you won't see with the other nutrients. So fructose causes weight gain and metabolic syndrome two ways. One is it actually has this effect on the mitochondria where it preferentially switches food into fat. But the other way it does it is it causes leptin resistance itself. So when you take fructose, you want to eat more. So if you do feed animals a lot of fructose, over time they can't control their appetite and they'll start gaining weight if they're allowed to eat more calories. But if the calories are kept controlled, it's hard to show weight gain because to show weight gain in most short-term studies, you really have to eat more than the other.
Yeah, well, that's what they want to do. I think you hit on so many key things there. So let me do a little repeating here and tell me if I get any of this wrong, just to try to tailor it to the listeners here a bit. So a first key distinction is obviously calories in, calories out is applicable. Like it applies in this model. It's just that we're saying the body is not some passive vessel to sit and consciously calculate this. In fact, the body has an amazingly complicated and proven system by which it does its best to regulate calories in and calories out based on the needs of the organism. Is that accurate?
Absolutely accurate.
Okay, so that is great. So listeners understand that. It's not that people are saying calories are irrelevant. No. It's just that the body is brilliant and it works to maintain homeostasis for calories just like it does for blood sugar and potassium and sodium and everything else. Second point, You talk about fructose being uniquely metabolically dysregulating. That seems like that could be an interesting, because you specifically said rat studies, mice studies, it's hard to make them gain weight over time, but if you feed them chronic levels of fructose, you'll see over time, even if you keep them isocaloric, meaning even if you keep feeding them the same number of calories over time, like let's say in a person from the age of 15 to the age of 45, you keep eating and exercising the same way, but somehow, magically, you gain 20 pounds of fat. Could something be going on there with fructose and metabolic dysregulation?
Yeah, I mean, let me give you a good example. So we did a study in rats where we put them on a high sugar diet that contains fructose, or we put them on a high starch diet. But in both groups, we fed them exactly the same number of calories. And in both groups, we put them on a diet. They were only eating 90% of what they normally eat. Now, when you put an animal on a diet, it's going to be very hard to show them to gain weight. They're eating less than they normally need. But what happened was that the sugar-fed animals, they still got really, really fatty liver. Their livers were creamy white. They developed insulin resistance, and then every one of them became diabetic. None of the starch rats became diabetic, and none of them had fatty liver. So this kind of study shows that there's something unique about sugar and about high fructose corn syrup. And when we studied this, we discovered it was the fructose that's the key issue. And the reason it's fructose is because the fructose specifically affects those mitochondria, and it affects their ability to produce energy. And it moves more of the food in to fat than to energy out. Now, I do have to tell you something, so one of the things that I like to point out is that when people gain weight and they're exercising, that we are eating too much and we are exercising too little. But as I say, the primary problem is not our Western culture. It's the fact that we've become leptin resistant and we've got these defects going. And fructose is one of those foods that causes this leptin resistance and this defect in fat oxidation, or our ability to burn fat. But I do want to say that doesn't mean that Western culture is not abetting it. I mean, the TV has gotten so good, the movies are so good that some of us like to watch TV because we like the shows. And so they are playing into, trying to entice you to watch the TV more. And there are enticements from, to try to go to these smorgasbords and things like this. But the underlying problem is not the culture. The underlying problem is what's going on in our bodies. But it's not to say that culture is not contributing. So there is some contributions from culture in making us do, these things where we're exercising too little and so forth. But the primary driver is what's going on in our bodies.
Dr. Johnson, I so appreciate you representing this as a both and rather than an either or, because so often this is presented as eating too much and exercising too little is the cause. And then someone says, no, it is absolutely irrelevant. And I think the correct answer, what the research is actually showing, is people to gain weight, by definition, are consuming too much and expending too little. However, why that is happening, it's the why that we need to unpack. Like if someone's anorexic, obviously the problem is they're eating too little and exercising too much. But unless we understand why, like why is the person not eating, we can't ever treat the cause rather than the symptoms, which are the behavior. The behavior is the symptom. We can bridge this gap and help people to see that it's not that calories are irrelevant, and it's not that calories are all that count. It's that there's an area in the middle, which is this gray space, which is what science has actually shown.
Yeah, this is one of the reasons, like the classic person who goes on a diet, people do have great willpower. Our cerebral cortex can tell us that, we shouldn't do this thing even if we would like to, So a lot of us can control things just based upon our willpower. And some people's willpower is less than others for sometimes biochemical reasons. But so we do have the ability to say, okay, you know what, we're going to go on a diet, and I'm not going to eat anything for, I'm going to reduce my intake or this or that, and people can do it. But if you don't fix the underlying problem, the leptin resistance and the trouble with oxidizing fat, you either have to always be hungry but just be super strong, or you're going to relapse. And so the problem is that many people can lose weight, but it's very hard to keep the weight off. And the trick, of course, is to try to get your mitochondria healthy again and to get off the foods that specifically trigger this. So you need to reduce your sugar. You need to reduce your high fructose corn syrup. I'm not telling you you don't quit eating sugar. I mean, you don't never have a birthday cake again. I mean, I'm not talking like that. I'm just saying let's reduce our sugar intake. Let's reduce, juices and stuff. Natural fruits are fine, but try to reduce your juices. Don't drink soft drinks. Reduce your sugar. Exercise, that's a great way to stimulate your mitochondria. Dark chocolate is another thing that stimulates mitochondria, but you don't want the dark chocolate to have too much sugar in it. So there are different things you can do, but the trick, you do have to burn off that fat, and so you need to exercise and probably reduce your carb intake to some extent, and then then you need to be wise. And if you do all those things, you will be able to keep your weight off.
And Dr. Johnson, it sounds like a lot of those things ensue, meaning that if you fix your mitochondria, if you re-regulate your metabolism, you will experience, as the research calls it, a spontaneous reduction in caloric intake. Like you will be full and you will eat less, but you won't be hungry. Like you're not trying to eat less. You're just like, oh, I'm full and I'd like to go for a walk because I have all this energy. Is that fair?
Yes, and I'll tell you a great trick to losing weight that I do. I think that the Atkins diet is a wonderful diet, but we don't really want to be eating high fat and high protein the rest of our lives, because the high fat can raise cholesterol, the high protein has its own issues, and then you're always on a severe carb restriction. So the diet that I recommend is actually to reduce your carbs and fruit sugars just for 2 of the 3 meals. And what happens is when you reduce the carbs for 2 of the meals a day, like breakfast or lunch, it allows your body to burn the fat, and it kind of cleans the system. And then on your final meal, you can eat a little bit of carbs. You don't want to eat tons of sugar and things like that, but but you're allowed to eat some. And if you do this, you can lose 1 pound a day. It's I talk about it a little bit in my book, but yeah, it's a very effective way because you basically allow. It's almost like intermittent carb fasting. So you're really avoiding carbs for 2 of the 3 meals, and that allows your body to preferentially burn fat, and then you can have delayed gratification only 12 hours away. You know what I mean? So if you really want that carb, you can wait. You know you're going to be able to have that bread tonight. So. I find this is a much more effective long-term kind of diet than an Atkins diet. But if those who can do an Atkins diet, all the power to you.
Dr. Johnson, it sounds like you just described a lovely way for us to turn on our fat switch or off, whichever way is the better way, which is also the title of your book, which is The Fat Switch. And listeners, you can learn way more about that, as well as hear from friend of the show and also a wonderful researcher, Dr. Mercola, over at fatswitchbook.com. Dr. Johnson, you already mentioned that you're tying ropes around people and ensuring they don't get eaten by bears. What else is next for you?
Well, we are doing some studies with hibernating squirrels, and we're doing studies in people where we've got studies going on in Kuwait. We've got studies going on in Poland. We have studies in Mexico. So we're doing both clinical studies and research studies, and we're really trying to get at the basis of what's driving obesity. So thank you very much.
Oh, well, thank you, Dr. Johnson. This has been an absolute pleasure. And listeners, do check out this book. It will help to replace that obsolete model in your mind that you have been given for the past 40 years, which is okay, right? I mean, people They did the best they could 40 years ago. They gave us what they thought they knew then, but we've got people like Dr. Richard Johnson who have done new science and new technology. And just like we don't use the same phones we used 40 years ago, we don't need to use the same approach to fat loss that we did 40 years ago. And the Fat Switch book, again, fatswitchbook.com by Richard J. Johnson, is a great way to expose yourself to the modern science of eating and exercise. On that note, I hope you enjoyed today's conversation as much as I did. And please remember, this week and every week after, eat smarter, exercise smarter, and live better. Chat with you soon.